So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th edition of DLT Fridays. We're so happy to have you here in the virtual world. I'm in Vermont under 24 inches of snow. So not only is this exactly what I'd like to be doing, it's about the only thing I can be doing right now. Today's subject is going to be DAOs and governance in the new world. And we have great panelists today who I'm excited to have on today. Emma Channing, who really is the preeminent mind of governance and regulatory compliance with regard to tokenization of assets and the new digital world. In full disclosure, she represented me in my attempt to start a tokenized fund, and we really had a fun time learning about the nature of the problems that we're facing trying to get there. Tim Lewis is a partner of mine in an effort that he started called DevDAO, which is DAO out of really DAO as a service, and he'll explain further what that is and why it's important. And with that, I hand it over to my able and fantastic co-host, Gordon.
This is Gordon Einstein. James loves me. It's all good. Everyone, welcome to DLT Fridays. And just get ready because the energy is about to go up. Good morning, everyone. It is 7 a.m. in Los Angeles. It's bright. It's early. I am not under 22 inches of snow. I'm under a repressive tax regime of the state, but that's a whole different story. Tim loved that. I love it. Emma loved it. We're all good. And I'm very happy to be part of this esteemed group. This is video coffee for me. I'm just happy to be here. And we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, DAOs and governance. And James, love you, buddy. I'm going to hand it back to you. And you're much more mellow.
I know.
Paternal tone. Please continue, and I'll just interrupt when I feel like it.
Okay. So, one of the things that's been happening in the market is the understanding that the regulatory regimes of the United States, which historically have been seen as rock solid representations of transparency and reliability and capitalism, have become less and less reliable over time for different reasons, some political, some social, etc. But the world is starting to realize that there may be other alternatives to the United States and to our regime. And in looking at how that's been evolving, there's been a movement towards decentralized organizations and how they might replace the current concept of incorporating and working with within the legacy form of governance and ownership. And so I wanted to have on some panelists who could talk both from the legacy world and from the future world. So from what you need to do today to be compliant, if you would like to be compliant and take advantage of the digitization of information and value. And then looking future-wise, what's coming next, what could change, and what that means to the system, and how that might evolve, and how we can create opportunities for ourselves. So I wanted to start with Emma. Emma, give me a brief background of yourself, and then talk about what you're working on and what you see as important in the market today.
Hi, my name's Emma Channing. I'm the founder of the Satis group. We focus predominantly on securitization through tokens. Specifically, we focus a lot on municipal tokens. We're hoping that Denver is going to be one of the first cities to issue muni bonds on a digital token. We also consult across a wide range of blockchain technology, including digital identity, CBDCs, stablecoins, that kind of thing.
Tim?
Sure. So Timothy Lewis, I'm a developer by trade. I'm the founder of Ikigai Asset Management. I also helped jumpstart a few networks along the last kind of 10 years. I specialized in data expediency, infrastructure design, and security for banks over my 20-year professional career. Now I'm interested, for the last 5 years, I've been interested in DAOs and securitization of assets. So I got my Series 7 when I was 18 years old. I've been working in banking since. I've been working with a lot of regulators on actually creating tokenized assets for different networks. And I do believe that the movement forward is DAOs and trying to understand how governance is supposed to look like in maybe a jurisdictionless world for organizational structure.
So Emma, can you talk to us a little bit about the evolution over the last 5 years? I mean, you were involved in the tokenization of some of the first funds and the creation of some of the first, what are now called, security tokens. So could you talk to us a little bit about your experience in the past and how the mood is changing and how the reality is changing in the market?
Yeah. Originally, when we did the first security tokens, they were a very high expense operation. It was a good idea, and it was particularly the BCAP offering was designed to show how it could be done. That led us to be using very, very high-end law firms and to be working with some very complex issues. Over the following years, as additional law firms tried to dig in, some figured out that you had to get the tax right before you could do the securities law, and some didn't. And quite often, tax issues were actually the main thing that blocked a particular security token structure from coming to fruition. Now the main activity, to be honest, through a bunch of factors that were out of our control, is that the main security tokens that are being issued by institutions. So you're seeing the World Bank, you're seeing Santander, and others do very large issuances, sort of in the 100 million range, using a wide range of technologies. So far, certainly last year, Ethereum was very much the dominant protocol, but if you look at what's going on this year, then Daml, Axoni, and a few others are really beginning to kind of take the change along with Algorand. So I think we're in the middle of A, a change of players, and B, a change of protocol, but I hope and dream that the idea will come back to its original fruition, which is to make it easier to raise small amounts. And certainly the cost of the technology has come down radically, and the familiarity amongst law firms of how to structure a security token is much, much better. So hopefully we will see interesting things in 2021.
Can I ask a completely ignorant question, which
Sure.
is, I would imagine, I mean, when an issuer issues traditional securities, that's a tax neutral event. It's a capital transaction, the initial sale. Where can you explain the intersection of tax with issuing securities?
So that is if you manage to get it under 1032. The issue starts with whether, when you're forcing the structure into however you want this to behave, the question is whether it is still clearly equity. Quite often people want to mishmash an equity and or debt-like structure in combination, and that doesn't work super well. There's also then some issues around structuring most of these are done through exempt funds, and there's some issues structuring the funds in a way that the cash flow flows where you want it to, and we don't end up with complicated issues with US tax in particular.
Interesting.
So, Tim, talk about, let's start with history before we get to the future. What have your experiences been with corporate governance and with trying to create businesses and trying to mesh them into the crypto/decentralized world?
I really just was a working schlep for the first 20 years of my life. Just working for large organizations, primarily banks, that and treated a lot of the engineers and us on the development teams, I think less than enjoyably. So I've never really had a pleasant experience. But I've been a historian of markets and historian of currency and market and capital formation. So much so that I went to Wall Street, got my Series 7 when I was 18, really started to kind of work at understanding how these things worked. And I realized after reviewing 350, 400 years of market formation that most often that people who did this were not the most admirable people to this time, up until the 30s and 60s when things started changing, and that it was all still much like currency, a mystery. And working with cryptography over the last nearly 30 years and seeing a lot of the movements that came in the 90s towards creating ledgers that were not government ledgers to control capital. When in 2012, while being a fan and interested in Bitcoin, I started learning about the second layer of Bitcoin, JR's paper. That's when some of the ideas about tokenization came out. In the Bit Angels, the first Bit Angels meeting up at the Bitcoin conference in San Francisco, and I think it was 2013. That really was the first tokenized sale. And at the time, I was really excited about the Jobs Act being in California. The Jobs Act was really moving along, and I've always felt it was kind of unfair, the access. Being 18 years old and passing the Series 7 does not entitle you to invest in investments that are held for accredited investors, which was a little unfair. And so I had a kind of a chip on my shoulder about that for quite a while. And seeing the Jobs Act was interesting, but this tokenization of cryptographic assets was more interesting. And seeing then the first sale or being involved in the sale of Ethereum was extremely interesting. And then, getting involved in creating these things and structuring these things from 2015, 16, 17, definitely recognized that these things were most often illegal securities. I'm an American citizen, so most often illegal securities. But that didn't mean that it wasn't, interesting and more applicable or more useful potentially than some of the other methods of equity that really wasn't tracked. There was no guidance for entrepreneurs to how to create proper cap tables and how to ensure or try to create value for those that invest in you along that way. So there had to be a better way. BitShares and the BitShares community was interesting, talking about DAX back in 2014. Dan did a great job. 2015, the DAO participation in what is, one of the larger, now confirmed illegal security sales on the internet that ended up in a massive hack, a massive theft, and will forever change code as law. So those things were always interesting, but it really kind of shot back this idea of what can these ledgers do, and what other aspects are these ledgers going to be useful for? So not only currency, and then not only potentially finance, but then also governance and record, and being able to control useful methods of again, the same things that the Bitcoin ledger is useful for, the Ethereum ledger is useful for, and that's transparency and immutability. Being able to create governance controls on top of that for individuals is something that I've been very interested in since 2015. So the only thing is I thought it was kind of being approached wrong. Most of these things in the early instances of them have been VC focused only, and that's probably just the method of how these markets are maturing. But they will be useful for so many other things, and so excited to see the evolution of them, and as they become more affordable, and we can kind of experiment more.
So governance, really comes down to a core concept of consensus, which is one of the key, the key concepts for the decentralized economy as well, is how do we form consensus? Historically, you could look at the law and you could look at the regulations, you could hire a lawyer, a banker, and an accountant, and they would tell you, how do you make your offering conform so that you have a safe haven? So now institutions and other investors who want the protection of that system can check a box. Yes, the lawyer says, okay, yes, they got an opinion letter from the accountants, and you can go forward, and that becomes a form of insurance, right? Because you can't make a mistake for having accepted it, because you can point to the fact that the deal was compliant, and that you could foresee the outcome, supposedly, because of the compliance. In this new world, with the decentralized economies and decentralized businesses, and these new forms of business, of governance that are coming in, new ways to form consensus, we're not yet at equilibrium where people can understand, what is that consensus? What am I relying on? What is my recourse if things don't go wrong? What can I really expect from this system, right? And so we're making this move in the world, and there's this uncertainty. So, Emma, when you're working right now and you have these people that come in that want a decentralized idea, and they want to have liquidity and peer-to-peer, but on the other hand, they live in the United States and they have assets, and their business is incorporated here, so they're in fear of forfeiture and other forms of management. Are you seeing that there's a change in what you're allowed to do, or what you're now being perceived as what's within the safe harbor?
I mean,
I said a lot there, and you don't agree with all of
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Where was the question, James?
You
My
can
friend.
unpack.
Let's pick a few things. So one of the good things that's come through is that, just as Tim was talking to, now particular qualifications can allow you to be considered to be an accredited investor. So one of the great 506C was the great revolution of the Jobs Act. 506C allows you to do a private offering of securities in a way that you would otherwise be doing in a public offering. So you can do interviews, you can have a website, all of these fun things. And now, because of some changes that came through this fall, firstly, you can take certain exams, including the Registered Investment Advisors exam, and you don't need to be sponsored for that one. You have to be sponsored for the Series 7, which Tim has. And that will allow you to be considered an accredited investor, as opposed to showing that you have $1 million stone cold in the bank, which is beyond most people's abilities. So that's the first change, which I think we're still going to see trickle through and make some changes. The second change was the cap on regulation CF, crowdfunding, which again, there's a limit on how much people can buy, but it's got up to 5 million from $1 million. So that really is now a very viable way for people to be raising their first seed round, even Series A. And I think we're going to see those tokenized crowdfunding platforms like Republic do very well out of that. But in terms of the safe harbor that we're talking about here, we're talking about Regulation D and Regulation CF. As for DAOs, I think there is a lot of controversy at the moment. I think you have to remember what we know from sort of our ICO days, which is people from 90 different jurisdictions are playing in DeFi at the moment. And in some of those jurisdictions, they lock you up and shoot you for doing that. And in some of them, they don't really care. And in some of them, they say you're a threat to national security. So I think you need to be looking at it from a global point of view, and you also need to be looking at it from not just from a US regulator perspective, where the US may, not having a clear centralized identity does maybe get you out of the first limb of the Howey test and so of all that. And that's kind of wishy-washy. But in terms of things like FATF and the money laundering rules, other jurisdictions like France, Germany, and so on that have otherwise been pretty friendly to crypto are quite likely to basically point to an engineer and say, you're it. And whereas in the US, we have an argument that code is speech, it's First Amendment protected speech. In any other jurisdiction, that protection isn't there. So I think that the jury is out on how successful DAOs are going to be at proving that they are truly decentralized.
Definitely, Tim. Go ahead. Guys, you don't have to raise your hand.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Tim, the perfect session is Gordon and I sit here and read comic books, and you guys talk.
I've already started.
No, so it's brilliant words. I think you're exactly right. I mean, in my belief right now is that there are no legal DAOs, right? So there's no jurisdiction that will allow an organization of at least the full extent decentralized autonomous organizations to exist in any legal form. You can't enter any contracts, enter into any agreements, and that's just the way that the state exists right now. I'm very hopeful, and I do think that there's kind of a bridge digital asset structures that get us from no DAO to potentially one day DAO as a sovereign entity. But I don't think that it is anytime soon. So my organization and what I work on and what I formed a nonprofit association in Switzerland to accomplish what I think are a lot of the what are a lot of the hopes and rules for governance based around how a DAO should operate while using a mechanism in compliant structure that exists currently. So we've got a very interesting structure as a nonprofit association in Switzerland. I think that allows us to vote with the intention of what a DAO is, but still leaves a couple people on the hook, right? So there's still a couple people to point fingers at and move forward with. But again, what you were saying, and I'll herald this, the changes that have come for accredited investor accreditation, fantastic. It's a great move. It was a long time needed. I think the SEC is really doing their job when it comes to moving us forward. Reg CF stuff, I actually now own a Reg CF brokerage firm. So now we are going to be launching our own Reg CF marketplace. A+ also went up, the Reg A, that's a little larger rounds there, but I am very, very hopeful and excited. We're still trying to work with the United States and bring the United States into this next level of tokenization.
Let me make one comment on that. Though, as a, I don't know, I always say I don't necessarily want the U.S. to win, but I wanted the U.S. to give things a good shot. And the foot dragging that's gone on in the U.S. from the regulatory perspective, I think that other jurisdictions, kind of to Tim's point, the fact that other jurisdictions are moving forward or providing solutions or semi-solutions, I think is putting a fire underneath the regulatory, of the U.S. to our ultimate benefit. Because unless there was this external international competition, we wouldn't be moving, because our incumbent systems worked well enough and kept the U.S. on top for a while.
But nature abhors a vacuum.
Yep.
And the United States has created a vacuum through inactivity and confusing inconsistency, right? And so while we say we support digitization, we say we support being the leader, the truth is we've abdicated that leadership.
Completely. It's kabuki theater regulation.
Maybe one of you would know. We were expecting a ruling today or moving forward. I think I mentioned. Does anyone know if that's been delivered yet?
About the custodial wallet thing?
Yeah. There is word that they've decided to go through a normal rulemaking procedure, which would stop what's going on, basically. That came through yesterday.
Fantastic. Yeah, this is at the center of probably a lot of your business right now, I'd imagine, is CDBC. And I'd imagine moving forward in that, talking about an international fire, the digital yuan is up, active, and being used.
Quite a lot of what we try to explain when we are in Washington, and I want to be super clear to the panel, I think these recent developments have been great. I'm not necessarily a fan of FinHub. I'm not necessarily a fan of the rulemaking that's been going on around broker-dealers and registered investment advisors with regard to digital assets and custody. That's other than Brian Brooks, Go OCC, that's been pretty difficult. We do, when we're in Washington, try to talk about national security. If you Google me and Nate Potter, there's a hilarious article I had to do back in 2017 on FSB infiltration into an ISO standard. I'm not joking, this is the strangest of my life. And we try to explain.
I just Googled, but I got Harry Potter, so I guess I made a mistake. Emma Channing and who?
Nathaniel Popper.
Harry Potter. That's my association completely. Emma and Harry Potter.
Nate Popper.
She's my wizard.
Popper. Okay, I'll find that and I'll put it in the chat for everyone.
I can do it in a second. Anyway,
it's like Emma at Hogwarts. I don't think that's what you meant. Okay, go ahead.
So no, we do try to talk about the fact that this isn't sort of horses milling around the yard and a few have got out of the gate. They're at 3 miles down the track, racing flat out, and China is 5 miles down the track. And the question is not about whether you stop or halt any activity in the US. It's, what you kind of manage to do in terms of opening and closing gates 10 miles down the road to protect and facilitate US business. and get in front of this issue that China is so far ahead. So yeah, fun times.
So let me step in for a second because we have our last guest has logged in. I think you're in Spain, right, Santiago?
That's correct. Hi, James. Hi, everyone.
So we have Santiago Siri, who's my good friend for the last decade. And, you know, Santi, you're coming in at a perfect moment right now because we're talking about governance and consensus and how historically we relied on the laws and on safe harbors created by legislation for consensus and protection and, et cetera, for institutions and general liquidity. And Emma's now talking about the transition now, what's happening currently in the market. We're talking about how the paralysis in the United States is causing the US to lose its leadership position in defining these safe harbors and the structures. And Tim is the founder of DevDAO, which is DAOs as a service, which we're now launching next year. So you are the person I know who best embodies this movement from centralized authority towards, community-based consensus. So I'd love if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and maybe talk about your journey from Argentina, the United States to Spain, and then we could launch into the future, talking about what's happening now in the future of DAOs and start that, and use that as a launching point.
All right. My name is Santiago City. I'm a researcher and software developer that has been in crypto for at least 8 years now, or maybe 9. Back in Argentina, where I am from, along with some colleagues, we started a political party that wanted to change democracy. The idea we had was to do a party where candidates would always vote in Congress according to people's will online. So we had to figure out how to do a political party, which is a very strange thing to do. And we had to figure out what it takes to build software that allows people to participate over the internet. Our original approach was betting on making simply open source software. Eventually, we learned that the client-server architecture is a very corruptible architecture for governance because whoever controls the database can manipulate and control the outcome of an election. And eventually, we realized, well, we have to work with distributed networks. Originally, we did some stuff with Bitcoin back in the day, using Merkle trees to store many votes in one transaction. And we did some pilots in different places around the world. The political party got 1% of votes, which was a lot actually for a new party, but we needed 3% to get someone elected. So back in 2015, we got a call from Y Combinator that moved me to the Bay Area. I lived in California for 2 years. And there was
I'm sorry, did Y Combinator accelerate or incubate your political party?
Well,
yeah, kind of. Not the party.
That's amazing.
If I could jump here for a second.
Sure.
Santi is a humble gentleman who doesn't lay out all those layers of subtlety of what he's saying.
Are you kidding? He's on my iPhone. He can't be that humble.
So waiting for my check.
You don't sound like Siri doesn't sound like you. They messed up your voice. But James, go ahead, please.
So Santi took what we're talking about as the future today in 2020 and 2012 was trying to implement it as a political party to get around corruption and centralization in Argentina, right? And then became he's the first company that was not for profit that was funded by Y Combinator because they thought what he was doing in forming democracy was so important that he got funded by a VC for not for profit. Right?
That is a huge statement.
So Santi, I had to say it. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Well, thank you, James. Yeah, it was a bit surreal to do YC among all the for-profit companies.
I'm sorry, I just got to ask. Did they reach out to you? Did you reach out to them? Like how? James, sorry, I know you got a pat, but this is
again. I'm going to step in for Santi. He was chased out of Argentina by the judiciary, the military, and the political system, and needed a new home. And came.
Each one of those is a badge of honor. But I still want to know: did Y Combinator reach out to you? Did you reach out to them, or what was the? How did the chromosomes meet?
It was a perfect storm because in 2014 we actually did a TED Talk. You can look for it.
I think I saw that actually.
My wife, Pia Mancina, and let me look for this is the link.
Just drop it in the general chat for everyone, please.
I put it to everyone.
We'll do it. Go ahead.
Keep talking.
we did this TED Talk. This TED Talk obviously gave us a lot of attention. We were suggesting, some former partner of YC suggested us to apply, and we did apply. And then we went through the whole process of the 10 minutes interview, which, they flew us to California, to San Francisco. We had the interview there in Mountain View in the YC headquarters. Weirdest interview in my life, only 10 minutes. We told them, how we did a political party. We showed them pictures of the campaign. In the campaign, we actually built a Trojan horse because our story was like we're doing a Trojan attack to Congress, and we showed them pictures of the Trojan horse, and Sam Altman went enthusiastic about us, and they offered to invest in us as a nonprofit organization. So we started Democracy Earth Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that aims to research democracy for the information age. We try to do it by developing technology that is open source, that uses censorship-resistant networks, and that it's cheap or free. And in 2015 we did YC. I lived in San Francisco for 2 years. My daughter was born there, and then I moved to New York. 26.
And actually, Siri, let me jump in 1 sec. Or Santiago, rather. The normal Y Combinator program, I think, is not 2 years. I think it's in and out in a year.
No, this is the 3-month program. I decided to stay in the Bay Area regardless after YC. So it was a 3-month program. We were winter.
But what really happened is they gave him the money. He spent 3 months injecting his DNA into them, and then he left on his mission to spread it everywhere else.
Right, that's pretty much a nice way of putting it.
You know what? We need a Santiago translator, because Santiago is, I mean, not because of English, but just because you're being overly modest, and I think you're depriving the audience of the glory that will inspire them to go do things themselves. Because when I'm hearing this, I'm getting jazzed up. I'm having the pleasure of working with James and Tim on some stuff, and when I hear this appeals to my anarchist lawyer soul. Everything you're saying. So just
you're talking to the right guy.
Lay it out there, brother. Don't be shy.
The session, everything before was a warm-up. Now Santi's going to finish his story, and then we're going to let Tim talk, and then I want to hear Emma's thoughts, because this is really you guys. I want you guys to talk amongst yourself, and Gordon and I are going to do our typical bad job of keeping our mouths shut.
So now fast forward to today, we're pretty much embedded in the research of DAOs. We have been, in the last 2 years, we have been pretty much building on Ethereum, collaborating with some key projects. Moloch DAO, for instance, which is a smart contract, very gas efficient, very minimalist in design and in theory. We have contributed to that project in different ways, which allows to deploy DAOs at a very relatively low cost, because gas costs today are still a little bit expensive. And then we have been researching different variants of game theory applied to democracy. An interesting pilot we did was in Colorado in 2019, still last year, for the state of Colorado, where we applied quadratic voting for state legislators to prioritize 107 bills that they were planning to introduce to the State House of Colorado. There's some also interesting articles about that I can share to the audience. We basically been trying to iterate of working with different types of organizations, working with different game theory models about how democracy should play out with different technologies. We tried everything. I'd say that probably the most relevant work we did this year was a paper we just published in a journal, in a scientific journal, Frontiers journal, this December, which is a paper that tries to understand how we can create systems that aim to formalize human identity over distributed networks. And this paper is called Who Watches the Watchmen? And it's a review of subjective approaches for civil resistance in proof of personhood protocols. It's a bit of a mouthful, but let me share with you the link. This paper was peer-reviewed, and basically the one reason why we don't have democracy just yet in the blockchain space is because we are not able to effectively formalize humans, but we need to find a way of formalizing humans in a way that we protect the privacy and the identity of those humans. So something that Edward Snowden said last year on Web3 that was very relevant was that we need to differentiate between verifying an identity and verifying the right to use a technology. A system for voting doesn't need to know who you are. It only needs to know that you haven't voted twice. So there's a race now of different protocols.
I'm sorry, Santiago, I'm gonna do my horrible job of not interrupting. I mean, it's not just that someone hasn't voted twice. You got to make sure that someone actually is allowed to vote in that election. I mean,
well, it depends. If we're talking about, I'm talking about elections in abstract. Obviously, if you are talking about elections in the United States, there are certain legal proceedings or legal status of citizenship or age that you need to have. But I'm talking in abstract. Any system for voting has you can verify the identity in different ways. You can verify the identity in a way that requires for me to disclose personal information about me, which makes me subject to surveillance, potentially subject to any kind of surveillance. Mm-hmm. Who am I putting my data on whose? And if I put it on an immutable blockchain, then today we have a democratic government, but tomorrow there might be a coup.
Are you sure? Never mind. I'll throw that bomb out there. Go ahead.
But Santi, there are ways.
That's what happens with the orange guy. But
there are ways to verify people's characteristics. Using techniques like zero knowledge proof, where I can authenticate that you have the right to vote without having to know who you are. And
there's been some projects that have been focused on the privacy aspect. We have been focusing more on the identity aspect. But both eventually the zero knowledge proof guys and the proof of humanity or proof of personhood guys will collide, and that's part of the effort we try to push on coming from Democracy Earth.
Great.
Tim, jump in for a second, Tim. I know your mind's
well, Santiago is an absolute legend, and thank you for your work. It's really been appreciated. You guys have just done such an amazing job fighting and continuing the effort forward, and it's great to hear that you're working on proof of personhood. A side note, if you haven't talked to Sam Altman in the last year, I know that's something I was at dinner at his house about a year ago, that there's a project that he's working on and wants to work on.
I got the
exactly.
Paper.
Okay. Well, he needs help.
I know it all.
Hopefully he needs help, right? So the idea, and he is a great guy. I'm glad to see that he really did give you a chance to shine out there. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is an amazing time to live in. And there's a lot of change, hopefully, that will be coming, not only for inclusion, but for security and for personal protection and personal identity protection is, I think, the number one concern that all humans should have right now. And being able to separate identity from governance. We separated religion from state, money from state is now identity from state is an evolution that we need to get to and be able to hold ourselves self-sovereign, and that is something that hopefully we're all fighting for and towards. Just to plug a little bit about what DevDAO is doing, slightly different to you, Santiago, is one thing as a developer, I recognize that my experience in 2014 while participating in the crowd fund for Ethereum was radically different than any of the other tokenized sales that I had participated in since. In 2014, for every 100 people, there were probably 90 to 95 devs that were participating in that process. And in 2017, 2018, that completely flipped. Mostly speculators in all of the deals that were going on. So when I wanted to continue work forward after founding Ikigai Asset Management and moving on from doing just equities trading or token trading, I wanted to do something to where we could kind of bring a nonprofit way of distributing, a decentralized way of distributing grant funding to open source developers in a decentralized world, and do that also from a non-tribalistic standpoint. The other problem is that we still have so much to build. Whether or not you were building on Bitcoin in 2013 or Ethereum 2014, 15, if you've moved on from then, who knows? But there's still so much that the technology needs beyond finance. The Ethereum gas prices might work for your DeFi contract, but they certainly don't work for your governance vote, and especially not in any timely manner. So there's so much work that needs to be done, and I think we've done a great job as we're launching this year. We have our primary grantor, our inaugural grantor, Casper Labs, has done a great job and granted us with a very large amount of their network, and to distribute that completely, protocol free. Doing that into a way to where people can just work on development as led by a peer group, and I hope that we migrate away from just the idea of these VC-based DAOs, and it's important to make decisions on venture. But ideally, that we'll move towards onto steering groups that can manage different types of things. And I'm excited to really have this experiment with a nonprofit grant giving association. So that's been something I've been really excited to bring forward. And Herb's jumped on recently, and I'm looking forward to talking to him. And there's a bunch of other people that are involved with us. So excited to be doing so and getting to talk with people such as yourself and Emma in this change of jurisdiction and compliance as we go through and try to make our way through the world.
Yeah, so Emma, when Tim told me about DevDAO and I learned about it about a year ago, I called him up and I said, Tim, it's really interesting what you're doing, but be careful, because in the ways that he was forming a entity first in Switzerland, actually in the US first, I think it was Colorado or Wyoming, and then he moved to Switzerland for jurisdiction to anchor the company. And I said, be careful, because the initial steps you take to anchor the company to create, to spring into the DAO concept are going to form the nexus with the legal system and are going to become your vulnerability in the long run. And so that dragged me into the discussion at DevDAO, and I got involved in how you deal with this transition, how you spawn this new concept of governance. What are your—
Actually, James, let me treat you like a guest. I normally do this. So this is a recurring point you raised, and I think it's worth expounding a bit. You kind of use the creature from the Black Lagoon reaching out analogy in my mind. Can you kind of lay the foundation there? Because I think it's a good one.
Well, I have, one of my thoughts is that you can't be partially decentralized, right? You can't be partially stateless. You have to either be completely decentralized and not have any touch points, or you need to be completely regulated and compliant. Because once you do the first motion that you do to become compliant, you create that lock, almost that point on the blockchain where you're anchored, where you have a point of severability, you have a point of, of enforcement. And so when I look at these models that come to me now, I'm really looking at them, which end of the barbell are you on? And if you're in the gray area, it's not really interesting to me, because in the long run, you can't be true to yourself, I don't believe.
Let me ask you, because I think we're all involved in a project where this may be aggregate, and I'll give you a softball that maybe you and Tim can respond to. Is there a place for partial decentralization on the path to full decentralization?
So I'd like to get Emma to talk about that, really, because I think if you want a black and white answer, I say no. I think you got to hold your nose and hope there's, jump in the pool and hope there's water. But Emma, we have on the phone here today on this call the people that I would reach out to call to talk about all these issues. This is my inner circle here. So Emma, if I called you up, what would you say?
No.
Snap! Oh my God. Okay, I like Emma.
Exactly.
I like Emma a lot. Emma, welcome back anytime. Actually, Santiago, Tim, Tim, I know you forever, so you're always welcome back. Sorry, I didn't mean to be exclusive, but Emma, go for it. That was beautiful.
So, one of the things that I did this year was set up a global think tank on blockchain policy, because that clearly needed to be done. And we have set it up fully decentralized. There is no central entity, there is no bank account, there is no trustee. There is just a group of 200 people and growing who are all interested in blockchain policy. And it's called Global Blockchain Convergence. You can find it on the web. Anyone is welcome. We try to have 2 technical people for every lawyer who joins. I think that is a good approach to all things blockchain. As for jurisdictions, one of my personal frustrations, and James has heard me howl about this several times, is that Switzerland worked for Ethereum and it hasn't worked for anything ever since. And it is a very difficult jurisdiction. It's the 3 national languages are French, an odd version of German, and Italian. And so unless you're fluent in one of those 3 languages, all of the documents that are going to be presented in front of you are going to be ones that you can't read. You might get a translation, which is going to be expensive, but that's also not the official document. It's also just an expensive jurisdiction to incorporate in. That's not to say that Switzerland hasn't done interesting things from a tokenization point of view, just as Wyoming has been doing interesting things from a tokenization point of view. But it's not a good jurisdiction. And if you were US based and trying to kind of set up, I would just set up a good old Delaware Corp and then kind of free your decentralized child from that and set it and break the connections. That's the only way I can think of actually creating something that's decentralized, is that it starts with a centralized team and then steps are made to make sure that that entity is in fact decentralized as it's pushed out from what is a centralized entity.
Santi, do you even think about nation states and the physical political borders anymore in the way you're setting up? How are you considering that when you're starting with, with the new concept or with the ones that you're working on already?
Well, the name Democracy Earth, I think that the .earth element of the name is, very powerful statement, because ultimately in cyberspace there are no national borders, and with encryption we have a tool for bypassing and for having ultimate sovereignty in the hands of the individual. So a lot of our notions, there's this quote from Naval, which is very good. It said, with crypto you can cross one border, one national border, potentially with billions hidden as a secret inside your mind. And because of the nature of secrets, sovereignty ultimately becomes restricted to the individual, which makes, we more and more are engaging in a global, borderless jurisdiction. And in that case, I think we are entering into that world. I live this in my own life. I lived in, ever since Bitcoin appeared in the picture of life. I lived in San Francisco, then in New York, now in Spain, and it's that kind of empowerment that comes from using this technology early on. And I think new generations understand this in a much better way. Now, I'm getting older also. I understand some of the reasons, why we have the governments we have. The history of our institutions must not be discarded completely. I'm by no means, trying to attempt something completely revolutionary and just swap everything away and replace it with something entirely new. I think that we have to understand a little bit of the blood, sweat, and tears that have created institutions that we have inherited and learn from those lessons. Maybe today we're in an age where there's this intergenerational gap, boomers versus millennials, or however you want to label it. But the fact is that technology is understood by a new generation in a way that generations that are currently in power in traditional institutions do not understand it. And we have to build bridges for each generation to understand each other. My experience doing politics in Argentina taught me a lot about the good things that are in our institutions, as well as a lot of very bad things. But it's I'm more concerned rather than the frontiers, which I think days are counted for frontiers with the internet, with crypto, and with all of this technology. I'm more concerned about how today we can close this gap between a generation that is completely unaware of what crypto is and the new generations that are just building the institutions of the future with this technology.
So I'm going to speak up and say, you use a word that I totally agree with, it's bridges. And it really is just trying to fill these gaps, but there's also access, right? And so many people don't have access to these technologies. So I push back a little bit against the idea that we have to, or we can go completely to decentralization, because the word decentralization, what does it mean? So many people throw around the word and act like it is there's an absolute definition, and there's no absolute definition of decentralized. We are using technologies in bridge mode right now to converge the abilities of these different things, from centralized organizations to what we hope will be a decentralized world. One of those evident being is the security tokens themselves. These types of things are centralized, equity assets that exist on what is apparently or supposedly or defined currently as a decentralized protocol or decentralized network. So there are a lot of things. I'm very hopeful that there will be safe harbors of the world that will one day allow for the ultimate goal of the decentralized autonomous organizations to exist, living in a world that does have rules currently. What we do need to push them and change them and try to work on them. But I think that there is, hopefully a chance to educate more people, bring people more along, because I believe in the process of democracy. We need to make sure that we are all in agreement. And right now, most of us in this industry are speaking in rooms filled amongst peers, very privileged peers who've been able to, not have education, access to the internet, be able to work on machines, have access to capital, and we need to make sure that everyone else is on board as well if we're going to make these major changes globally. But I'm very hopeful for it all. I just think that there's a lot of work to do.
Emma, what do you see happening on the ground? For the people that are coming in, to talk to you about the businesses they're trying to start, or the tokenizations they're following, even municipalities that you're working with. How is this transition being handled in the real world?
I think a very good question is, when you use the term decentralized, what do you mean? Do you mean decentralized in terms of number of machines? Do you mean decentralized in terms of how many core devs have access to controlling protocol? There's a lot of questions there. And I tend to kind of prod and poke at decentralized, because do we really need decentralization for securities? Not really, no. That's why when JPM took Ethereum and forked it into Quorum, it forked it into a private network. And I recently read a piece in Crowdfunder Insider, I'll pull it up and put it in the chat, on the errors that we're seeing in Solidity. Particularly errors in Solidity from people who don't understand how Solidity compiles into the bytecode. And while you're still seeing those kind of errors, particularly in Ethereum, but it's not unique to Ethereum. I think you want to be on a private network for securities. And you don't need the redundancy of decentralization for securities. The redundancy of decentralization for digital identity, well, heck yes, we do. And that's one of the issues with Libra and now Diem, is one of the worst things we don't want to centralize identity again. We have a problem with centralized identity, and the last thing that we want is centralized identity along with centralized financial history. Right. That's an identity problem. So just a few things to think about there.
Emma, if I could stick you with the role of defending the system here, why do I need to surrender my identity to make an investment?
You're not sticking me with the role of defending the institution. That's definitely not. It's definitely not the role that I'm taking. I'm taking the role of, I don't want to be persecuted and placed in jail or shot for the things that have to change, right? So I totally agree. There are a lot of things that we need to change, but at the same time, if you look at the history of market formation and capitalization, it was wrought with just scams and horrible people. Right. And so making sure that people were, really was, for the first 400 years, was just all, not so good people that were creating this new way of, generating value for the most part. And,
actually, Tim, that second time you mentioned that, what do you mean?
Before the 1930s, before we had the Securities Act of 1933, please read, earlier than 1605, or earlier than the first recognized corporate structure. Often these times were asset formations of governments or religious organizations, right? And not all the time were they. There was never a ledger that was kept in a way that was accurate. Most often these ledgers were always manipulated by the people that were running them, whether they, be the religious organizations, governments, and then further into the sidewalk marketplaces. Those weren't very accurately kept. I mean, that's why Reformation had to come. from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, manipulation was the name of the game for the marketplaces, and many many markets got abused, and that's why the Act of 1933 came in and at least tried to reform things. When we had the electronic clearing companies come to forth in the late 60s, that cleared things up quite a bit and changed marketplaces then as well, leading us closer and closer towards the DTCC formation in the late 90s, which again, identity was an essential part of making sure that people weren't just ripping people off the whole time, right? And so there were parts of, especially in formation and understanding how to value what underlying value and assets were there. We didn't have the systems prior towards a lot of what we're building now to be able to verify that without being able to have some legal ledger somewhere identifying some real person to be able to say that this was an accurate statement of something you were selling and something that you were expecting to receive or then owned, and then could have this person hold this ledger to identify you as the person who owned that, right? So we're creating the technology to eventually be able to securely mitigate that process, but it's it is not there yet. And also you still have in the technologies that we use, you still have the lost asset capability of these, if you're just talking about privatized securities, right? So if we have no ability to, if it's not like lost Bitcoin, good luck, it's gone. There's really nothing you're going to be able to do to recover. But should there be systems, especially when we're talking about securities, which I would agree with Emma, really might have a place in public ledgers, but really are things that should be able to be recoverable and identifiable, at least in the current status of them, because we don't have the system design in place to enable people to recover assets that might be rightfully theirs, or potentially rightfully somebody else's if they do own them. So I think that there is the eventuality that we create systems that are capable of allowing us to have our sovereign identity and recover the assets in which we are entitled to, and also abide by a lot of the laws of the countries in which we choose to live in, for the protections that those countries offer. Just hopefully our borders are open a little bit more, and you can decide what kind of jurisdiction and what kind of rule sets you might agree to. I believe in the potential of the governance of protocol that you choose to work with, and then maybe in a future state, the types of assets that we hold or the types of agreements that we enter into when working on these networks or maintaining our assets on these networks will describe exactly what type of identity or what type of what you have to agree to when working with assets on those systems.
So we go back to this concept of decentralization, and you guys are right. 400 years ago, when capital formation was happening, and it was by religious organizations and by governments before it was corporations, there was always the thumb on the scale, right? And there was the miscount that was hidden from you, but you were told it was okay because someone was taking care of you. And that evolved to the idea of centralized authority to govern those people who had their thumb on the scale. And then it turned, over the last couple decades, it's turned into the guys who we centralized and gave the authority. They've had their thumb on the scale too, and they're basically focused more on maintaining their own hegemony than they are on protecting the people who brought those organizations into existence. And now we're at the next phase of how do we disintermediate those people and make it so that we trust each other through a trustless system, and that's really where we are, moving today. Santi, when you talk about decentralization, what does it mean to you? To me, it's consensus gathering, and how is the consensus formed? That's what needs to be decentralized. I don't care about the technology so much or the other pieces. I care about how is consensus, how is governance. How do you see it?
I tend to view it from a political point of view as whatever means helps us achieve censorship resistance. The idea that a message can be, or a transaction can be coerced or can be modified or corrupted, and that there can be a single actor in an economy or in an ecosystem that can have that power is seriously becoming more and more threatened, regardless of where you stand from the ideological spectrum, whether you are on the left or the right. It's clearly that more and more pressure is being put against certain types of messages in China, in the US, everywhere in the West. There's a rising polarization that seems to be breaking down our societies everywhere in the world. Democracy is pretty much being challenged from every single aspect, and we're going through a huge institutional crisis. And in that context, to me, the most salient event this year, it was not the American election, but what happened at the same time of the American election, which was suddenly Bitcoin breaking 14, 15, 16, 17, now we're at $22,000. That whole bull run began on November 3rd, while the United States was imploding with an institutional crisis without being able to formalize who's gonna run the country the next 4 years. At the same time, you had this incredible amount of capital flocking nowhere else but to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all of these new networks that are, challenging the status quo in so many ways. So I think this is the narrative of the 21st century. The narrative of the 20th century was probably the failed socialist experiments that happened in Russia, Cuba, China, whatever, that eventually some of them adapted to the inevitability of markets, but those who didn't disappeared. And there are some very valuable lessons of the 20th century. And the great experiment of the 21st century is not Marxist, it's Nakamotian. It's from Satoshi's experiment. We're in Satoshi's century now. And I think that the immutability that these networks achieve through the consensus mechanism, through the fact that we can do distributed consensus using cryptography, is because it guarantees us that we'll have censorship resistance. Now, the big question is how these networks are going to be governed by the law. And that's a huge question. And there are some cases we can pay attention to, which are interesting to look at, but there's very little precedence in courts or we're in uncharted territory.
Santiago, let me jump in 1 second because you're touching my funny bone when you say this. Perhaps law needs to fundamentally evolve itself to become something other than what it is now in order to govern this new world. Maybe there's a fundamental disconnect between our written out English text structures and this code-based, algorithm-based Nakamotian future.
It's there's a researcher from Ethereum, Vlad Samtir. Vlad
and I are good buddy. We've actually debated this in Odessa, Ukraine. So I'm loving that you're saying this. Go ahead.
All right. Vlad has a lot of. He's a researcher in law. Like his last 2 years, he has been tweeting and ranting about law and the difference between the sphere of law and the sphere of cyberspace or crypto in itself. And I've been learning a lot about law this year for different reasons, different projects. I've been literally reading laws and understanding how judges interpret them and what's and it's a fascinating world. And unfortunately, engineers do not pay that much attention to it. So there's a big disconnect between lawyers and engineers. But we should figure out ways of bringing together these two universes because the implications are very important.
That was one of the main theories behind DevDAO, and the fact that we both have to have not only technical frameworks but legal frameworks. And one of the big parts of pushing forward and understanding how the grant system should work. I think Gamma was right. It's usually about a 2-to-1 ratio of engineers to lawyers, at least maintaining that. But we do need enough lawyers to understand what we need to do. So then the engineers can codify that and make sure that we have implementations that work.
But going back to things being fractals and all being the same, you call the laws the code. It's the legal code, right? And to me, code is law, right? Because when you write the code, it determines how decisions are made in a specific case. So that code becomes the law in its own little ecosystem, and how big that ecosystem grows is a matter of case by case issue. So when we start to talk about political boundaries coming down and social boundaries coming down and economic boundaries coming down, it's the same thing in the legal world, in that historically the laws have been defined by political states, like the laws of the United States are for the US. And when Gordon talked about laws, he talked about English, it's put in English. But laws don't have to be in English, that's a very US-centric concept. That laws, right? There's laws everywhere else in the world, and every country has their own laws and they're in their own language, right? And so these conflicts historically.
I feel like I just got busted. Sorry, when this human language on paper or digitized is not code. At best, it's pseudocode.
Throw the Neil Stephenson. We have to have one Neil Stephenson reference in every conversation, guys. So this one is Neil Stephenson's reference that language is, that language is a virus, right? That I inject in you ways to think by getting thoughts inside your head, and the way I communicate it actually affects how it's received and how you behave on it. What language you speak actually affects your emotions and how you respond to things. But when I look at code now, code is law, right? And so now if we get to an algorithmic future, and DAOs, and Emma's gonna shoot me, and we get to algorithmic reality, that I can start to define my relationship with you through algorithms that are transparent and distributed on a ledger. That's different than the artificial laws that are being created that I have to figure out what is a security, right? And what is the Howey test? And and someone please explain to me the interplay of the IRS's regulations with crowdfunding and with international fundraising, and whether or not I can do a deal with somebody, right? And so I think that this concept of law is actually going to change, And Emma, I segue that to you, and then all the way through the horseshoe of everyone else on the phone call here.
So no, code is not. Sorry.
I love that you do that. You've done that actually a couple times.
No.
It's just a rhetorical body slam. Please go on.
Law is, at its very essence, law is either stuff that's codified in regulations, legislation, or it's case law. That's law. Law is rules. And they come from legitimate places, which makes them enforceable and therefore legal. This is law. Code is not law because it doesn't come from any of those places. Code can enforce laws. And when you are building an issuance platform, one of the most important things is that you have someone like me who sits with my compliance policy, and I sit next to the developer, and we need to make sure that every time and every which way you can potentially break the platform still complies with the compliance policy and does exactly what the compliance policy means and needs to. And that generally needs someone who can speak both code and law and can speak to both ends of the problem. But that is the closest that code gets to being law. So yeah.
Santi, in your vision, how do you see this falling?
I think there was, just to add more controversy to this conversation, there's a famous lawyer, Lawrence Lessig, who wrote this book called Code 2.0. And he argues that the things that are codable or that belong to the realm of code are things that operate, law itself, the rules of society, norms, how society behaves around those rules, markets, the incentives that markets contribute to the behavior of participants in society, and architecture, how those you can create code based on those four realms: architecture, markets, norms, and law. He argues, when we look at law from code from the point of view of software, hardware is the architecture, markets is how you install the software, the rules of the software or the code of the software itself is the rules or the lawmaking of how the software operates, and the norms is how the user behaves around the software. And he argues that Lessig argues that there's a new kind of Code 2.0 was actually the title of that book. It's 20 years old. It's an old book by now, and technology changes very fast. But I think that he made some interesting comments on the nature of code and how it can be compatibilized with something with the nature of law.
So Lawrence Lessig is an absolute hero to all
Mhm.
people. He was just an amazing man. Electronics Frontier Foundation. We're so lucky to have him. That is an absolutely fantastic book. And sometimes you do have to look into the future and try to give an explanation of what the future might be before the realities exist. So definitely material that should be read. For James' question, I mean, the code is law argument has to change because we are humans and we err. I think that we can create systems and we can codify them and we can remove intermediaries to the best of our efforts. And those things I think will exist. And so I do look forward to a time where we are running business and understanding of how we can interact with each other through algorithms and continuing that effort before we integrate into this oasis ourselves. But I think that that period is may or may not be within our lifetimes. We're just all continuing to work towards it.
Tim, when I recently on a show said I'm pissed off that I'm not going to get to Mars within my lifetime, you body slammed me for being negative. So if getting to Mars is realistic, I think moving to codified
I mean,
law.
Kurzweil says we might reach this the moment to where we have integration in a relatively soon time. So there is hope. I don't give up hope on anything at all. But there's just a lot of Herculean amount of effort and work that needs to be done from so many different industries and so many different parts of efforts of humanity. I'm just so glad that, especially during times like this and in a pandemic, that the work that's gone on from the late 60s to now in networks and computers allows us all to continue these efforts, and hopefully we have enough bright people in the world working on things to make some of these science fiction realities, fantasies, a reality.
And that's what DevDAO is all about.
So hopefully. We'll get there. You guys have to suffer with us 8 more minutes, then I'm going to let everyone do their own spiel on what's important to them. So, I mean, what I'm looking for is when I enter into a system, I want to know, I want to have a fair understanding of how I'm going to be treated, of what the outcomes are going to be. I don't have to like all the outcomes, right? And some of them can be against me, but I'd like to be informed in a way that I can read exactly how the system's going to perform. And I think that the problem with the current legal system is that it's politically driven and it's subject to change, and not in ways that are transparent, where you can actually see how the sausage is made. And so that's the point where I'm hoping that the new way of gaining consensus and decentralization can have impact, in that I can understand, this system is rigged, but I understand exactly how it's rigged, and I can see exactly where the levers are, and I can make a decision to enter into this system or not, and go into another jurisdiction. I mean, historically, the wealthy have been able to choose jurisdiction and choose tax regimes, right? They've been able to go to Switzerland or Panama or other countries and basically decide how they'll be treated. But the average person has not been able to do that. And I think the new systems enable us to enter into these other realms where you democratize the ability to choose your jurisdiction and choose how you get treated. But the question is, where does that leave the current legal system? Where does that leave the current governments? And is there a smooth transition that comes in? And because there probably isn't, it causes people to say, oh no, that can't happen, and that's not right. And I think it's that fear between how the transition actually happens, and the desire to do it. I think that's really where the friction is right now.
I think it's the question of separation of money and state, and whether or not we're gonna exit peacefully is the real question. And once money is separated from state, then how we decide to change the law and rules when the power of currency no longer dictates the democratic reality.
Well, I think Dave Johnson, my partner in one of my businesses, is a huge Hayek fan. And one of the things that Hayek talked about 30, 40 years ago was that love has changed over time, and politics have changed over time, and religion has changed over time, but money hasn't changed over time, right? And that I think we're in the middle of that transition of money changing, that the nature of what money is and how it's used and why it's important to us, was held static by governments for hundreds of years because it was important to the self-determination of the state. And I think now this introduction of Bitcoin and the cryptographic world has kind of cut through that chokehold that governments have had on value and on transactions. Because to me, how I use my money and how I hold my money is one of the ultimate expressions of my freedom of speech, right? Because how I exercise my value is something that I don't lie about. I don't buy things I don't want. I don't invest in causes that I don't believe in. So if you start telling me what I can invest in and how I can do it, and start monitoring me and judging me based on those things, then you're censoring me. And I think that right now, that's what we're bridling against. That's what the Nakamoto, that's what this Satoshiism is about, right? Let's, you guys, we have 15 more minutes. I'd love for you guys to talk about what's important to you. What's the message you want to get out? And what's the thought that you want people to think about as they travel around into the new year? Emma, let's start with that.
Sure. I think whenever we get into these questions of money and Bitcoin and so on, I think you need to come back to taxation and, why do people pick these jurisdictions? Well, they pick these jurisdictions for tax treatment. And I think you need to think really about the world that you want to see around you. I'm single, I don't have children, I pay taxes, both into my county, into my state, into the federal government. Why do I do that? Because I want to see a populace that's well educated, that's well taken care of, because that's ultimately good for me. And I think when we get into these conversations about money and Bitcoin and so on, it gets way too individualistic, and we don't live as individuals, we live as a community. And life is a communal experience. So that's my pushback against the libertarian Bitcoin movement. I personally am interested in two things. Number one, I'm interested in blockchain-based technology becoming a real thing. We have a fascinating habit as a community of building a thing and then going, oh no, and tearing it up, and building it again 6 times and then coming back to the original one and going, actually this one worked better. And 2 years has gone by and the institutions in the meantime have grown big pointy teeth and are pouring millions and millions and millions into blockchain technology. And I would like to see this ecosystem of believers and thinkers and philosophers survive what I see as an oncoming rush of institutional power and money into the space. I would also say, much of what I do is because I want to see people be able to raise money for their companies in a more equitable way. And I would like to be able to see people participate in investment in a more equitable way. And that's why I'm so passionate about bringing municipal finance down to $100 denomination as opposed to $100,000 denomination, so that people can actually invest in their communities and get a good return from what is a safe financial product. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Tim?
I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think freedom, I think that is still the echoing thing in my life that allows me finding that freedom. I didn't have it, I think, until really Bitcoin and then Ethereum. I didn't really understand. I mean, I came from a middle-class family, very privileged to have been born in the middle of Ohio on a farm, but my view of the world was very limited, and my 3 corners didn't include a lot of travel. And having the ability, seeing the ability through these networks and change to meet others and recognize and realize that community beyond the institutions that were defining life as I had seen it previously, brought upon a great amount of freedom to myself, and I see that the value in trying to infect and spread that to others. And I echo the same sentiment of Emma in the worry that this technology can be used for not good as well. can be used by the existing institutions to change, to just modify and kind of be a stranglehold around the things that they want to exist, versus the ability for individuals to express value in a free way. And that's hopefully what this is, and express, ownership and sovereignty in a free way. So I still believe that this technology is going to be used for good. I very much ascribe to the world of open source and making sure that we are going to fund a development not just for financial reasons. And I hope that there are more organizations and institutions that try to find a way to incentivize individuals to be able to speak freely in their code and with their own financial transactions, and how they want to communicate value. So that's what I'm trying to live every day, and really happy still to be in this community that has a bunch of people that can express their own ideas, but I think are all centered in good, and hopefully we can create change and include people, and spread the virus of freedom through the rest of this good green earth that we all live on.
Santi?
I'd like to also pick up on the values of community. I think it's very important that we understand how relevant that is for quality of life. Maybe as a personal note, I can claim that moving from New York to Madrid brought me more communal sense of life, at least for raising my family. It was a positive change in that regard, although I miss New York every day for different reasons. But we were building technologies that need to understand how they're going to face society, not only capital. Capital is an incredible fuel. It has a tremendous potential to change lives around the world, to generate innovation. It's the one game, capitalism, that really helps discern successful experiments from failures. And we need to understand the future of that, but never lose sight that the fact that we're building these technologies are aiming to replace institutions, are aiming to, or to become improvements of existing institutions, or to change how we relate with each other in more ways than just mere finance. And in that regard, exploring how we can do governance, how we can do what it means to be a protocol politician, what it means to what new roles are going to be generated by the new type of technology. We need to understand that very well. And if we're able to crack on difficult problems like the human identity problem, I think we will get closer to see a more social blockchain emerge, not just the financial one. And a social one would mean some tool that would be able to do airdrops globally, would be able to generate systems of governance that look more democratic than plutocratic. And the sense of community will be strengthened all over around the world. I come from Latin America. Institutions are a gigantic failure over there. Corruption is rampant everywhere you go. It's embedded in the culture. And there's simply hopeless support for the next politician among the people of the countries like mine. So suddenly seeing technologies like Ethereum, Bitcoin, really brings hope back to citizens in countries like mine. And it can be an incredible force for change and for improving the economics and the politics of society. So I'm a technologist. I'm designed to be an optimist. There's no other way around. If you believe you can create or contribute to the future, you have to be. I've been through a lot with Democracy Earth and with politics in the past. I know how the pessimists feel because I felt that heavily in my career as well. But we need to wake up every morning hoping to build a better world for the next generations, and we owe it to them.
First of all, Santi, I see you more as a Catalan than a Madridista, but we'll talk about that later. It's this transition we're going through. The point of community and supporting each other is so big, in the decentralized concept and the crypto world, Emma. So I think you're exactly right. And the biggest question the biggest response I get when I talk about this idea of moving towards a algorithmic world, with stateless borders, is who's going to pick up the garbage, who's going to be the police, right, et cetera. And I think that those are the things that people like that you guys who are on this call are going to wrestle with, and that we need to start thinking about how to solve these questions, because I think that the historic systems, they're showing that they don't work, right? I mean, the concept of police, right? Who do the police protect at this point, right? Thank God the US military has stayed out of the election, right? How many times you read the paper in the last 6 weeks about someone, a former general, the president, a senator, asking for military intervention and the Insurrection Act so that we can deny the voice of the people, right?
Let me jump 1 second. What got me super freaked out as someone who likes the US is when those Texas politicians were talking about a union of states that will abide by the Constitution, as in break up the current union. I was like,
but that's what I'm talking about. The system is broken and it's falling apart. It's crumbling through our fingers as we're holding it right now. And so the question is,
you sound like Princess Leia talking to Darth Vader.
But how do we get together? The question is, how do we use these tools that we have at our hand now, these new ways to communicate, right? And how do we do it to create new systems where we actually know how the garbage is being picked up and what it's actually costing us, and that we actually voluntarily come into a system where our garbage is picked up because we understand that we want to participate in that system and that other systems are available to us for it. And it might be idealistic and it's not here today, and I understand all those things, but we can't keep holding on tighter and tighter and tighter to the legacy system and think that that's going to make it better or solve the problems when we're being seen every day that it's not solving our problems, right? We're heading into a wall at an ever increasing pace, to crash. And we need to figure out a way to go around the wall and redefine the wall. And I think that that's really what we're all talking about here.
I'd just like to say that there's another Santiago City. I have no idea who that person is, which is very funny, by the way.
In the chat, civil attack happening right now.
It's not like I'm talking and typing.
Well, this is why you need to solve your identity issue quickly. Because how do we know you're him?
Kudos to whoever got in with using my name.
And honestly, we can't. We don't even know if you are you in this video chat.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Those are the things we have to do.
Go to my psychologist right after this, so I'm going to be talking about.
If there's two of you, you're going to get a double bill for schizophrenia.
Yeah, just left.
I'm a deep fake. I'm a deep fake, so don't worry about it.
To respond a bit to James, man, it's about education and access to education. If we want change in this world, maybe instead of including in part of a basic general basic income is going to be some sort of a basic learning income, and allowing people to continue to be educated. That is our I think our best weapon in a world of change, is to make sure that people are educated and have access to education in a decentralized way, making sure that the material says, making sure that the truth or the proof isn't just written by the victors, but it's written by consensus.
Yeah, but so to paraphrase someone much smarter than me, who I don't even know who it was, decentralization is messy, right? And so, the idea, I don't want there to be a common form of education. That sounds even worse than what we got now, right? I think you need to allow for the signal and the noise, and to allow the two to keep evolving, over time to improve. Otherwise, what works today doesn't necessarily work tomorrow. So last thought here is, each of you guys are fantastic. I really appreciate. Thank you, Gordon and I both thank you all for coming on. I'd like to give you a brief commercial moment to talk about your own organization for a minute. Give out your URL and how people reach you, and what problems you're looking to solve that you'd like to work with other people on. Emma, I always start with you. I don't know why.
She's the
Sure. We're satisgroup.io. We're predominantly working on municipal finance and various things relating to custody and security tokens. Always interested to hear from anyone interested in that, and in particular from municipalities.
Tim?
We're DevDAO now. We're on the Developers DAO on Telegram. We'll have a website up when I complete that into a place where I want to educate people. But emerging tech, it's emergingte.ch. And yeah, we're trying to give grants out to individuals in a decentralized manner, and trying to find grantors, especially within the decentralized space, that want to move away from just the foundation structure that we've been used to, and more into a protocol agnostic decentralized steering committee. So we're looking for developers, lawyers, engineers, and the people that want to participate.
Santi?
I run Democracy Earth Foundation. You can look for us on GitHub as Democracy Earth. On democracy.earth, you can try the technology we have been building throughout these past 5 years to explore and browse DAOs on Ethereum. And since we talk a little bit about education for Spanish speakers, we have launched DAO.education, which is a series of courses to teach about crypto for Spanish speakers in Latin America, in Spain, in the US, that might be interested in learning from, to grasp the tools of using Bitcoin and Ethereum from scratch.
All right. Gordon, go for it.
If I may, Gordon Einstein from CryptoLaw Partners. I'm the crazy attorney who left law and then went back into law because blockchain and Bitcoin grabbed my soul. So some people, when they escape from prison, don't check themselves back in, but I check myself back in because I'm very dedicated to the idea that these technologies can change the world. And I think to one of the points Emma made earlier, for me, the payoff in this field is obviously the tech is interesting. That's why I'm back in it, but the people are amazing. And I'm jazzed up just talking to and listening to our guests. Like I feel a little, especially from Santiago, I'm getting a little Che Guevara vibe. And like I'm yes, I know. I can feel that with you, my friend. So I don't know. My blood's boiling again. So I want to thank everyone. And this is, if I'm going to practice law, this is the area to do it in. James?
So I'm James Haft. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. I run a company called PALcapital. We're PALcapital.com. We focus on the intersection of technology and the digitization of information and value, and how the decentralized concepts of distributed ledger are affecting us from politics, the economy, religion, etc. And so along that line, we're about to actually launch a public company in Norway, which is going to offer people direct access to the new concepts and to have a diversified portfolio of investments in platforms, protocols, exchanges, and wallets. This will all sound very familiar to Emma, but I've decided to use the public arena for it because that's where the liquidity is. And so look for us there. So it's PALcapital.com. Thank you all for joining us. I really enjoyed this. It's amazing to sit down, and I can't wait till the COVID thing is over and we can hug, because you all know I'm a hugger. Exactly. So I miss you all. And thank you. Have a great day and a great weekend. And I hope you're all safe for the new year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Appreciate it. Great show.
Bye, guys.
Thanks a lot.